The Jedi Order had long stood as the Republic's defenders, their very presence symbolizing stability. For generations, they mediated disputes, upheld justice, and kept darkness at bay. Their lightsabers, once seen as symbols of peace, now ignited in war. The Clone Wars had turned them from guardians into soldiers, a transformation that few within the Order were willing to acknowledge. The war demanded total commitment. The Jedi, once above politics, became deeply entangled in military affairs. They strategized, commanded troops, and led attacks on Separatist strongholds. The Republic celebrated their victories, but the cost was greater than most realized. The Jedi Order was never meant to be an army, yet now they directed the largest military force in galactic history. Every battle changed them. Every loss pushed them further into exhaustion. The more they fought, the more they strayed from their ideals. Civilians who once revered them began to see them as symbols of war, not peace. The Council had insisted that this was their duty, yet some Jedi questioned their path. Whispers of discontent rippled through the Order. Were they still protectors of peace, or had they become tools of war? The Republic they had sworn to defend was also changing. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, once a politician, had become something more, a figure whose power seemed to grow with every passing day. He spoke of stability, of unity, and yet his grip on the Senate tightened. The Jedi, once the trusted advisors of the Republic, were increasingly seen as obstacles to his vision. Some senators distrusted them, others questioned their loyalty. The Jedi sensed the shift, but few dared to confront it. Among the clone troopers, there was unwavering loyalty. They fought beside their Jedi generals, saved their lives, and shared in their victories. Yet, there was something beneath the surface, something unspoken. The Jedi saw them as comrades, but the clones were more than soldiers. They had been created for a purpose, one that had yet to be revealed. Across the galaxy, Jedi Knights and Masters found themselves more isolated than ever. Many fought on distant worlds, removed from the support of the Council and the Temple on Coruscant. They had been deployed across thousands of battlefronts, spread thin by the very war they were trying to end. They did not realize that this isolation was by design. Doubt festered. The Force itself felt clouded, its guidance murky. Those who looked too closely at the events unfolding around them found only fragments of a truth they could not yet grasp. Something was coming, something inevitable. The war had forced them to abandon tradition, to embrace strategy and power, to fight as warriors instead of mediators. They had trained for centuries to resist the dark side, but they had never prepared for betrayal. They believed they were winning. They thought they were closing in on the war's end. But the final battle would not be fought against Separatists or Sith. The greatest threat to the Jedi was standing beside them, blasters in hand, waiting for the signal. The Jedi had spent generations defending the Republic, but they never saw the true enemy rising within its own ranks. From the shadows, Darth Sidious played the galaxy like a game of Dejeric, moving his pieces with patience and precision. The Clone Wars were never a conflict between two factions. They were the execution of a plan that had been set in motion long before the first battle droid was activated. Decades before the war, the Sith had already begun laying the foundation. Jedi Master Sifo Dyas, a member of the Jedi Council, foresaw a time of great unrest. Fearing the Republic would be caught unprepared, he sought a solution, one that led him to Kamino. There he secretly commissioned an army of clones, believing that a force bred for absolute loyalty would be the Republic's safeguard. He never realized that his vision had been manipulated. Before he could reveal the full truth, he was eliminated. His project was hijacked by Darth Tyrannus, known to the galaxy as Count Dooku, and repurposed into a weapon. On Kamino, the cloning process was precise, almost mechanical in its perfection. Every soldier was designed from the genetic template of Jango Fett, a warrior of unmatched skill. But there was more to their creation than superior combat training. Each clone carried something hidden within their very biology, a failsafe buried deep in their minds. The Kaminoans, known for their scientific expertise, engineered these soldiers with the utmost efficiency, but they were not the architects of their most critical modification. That distinction belonged to the Sith. The inhibitor chips were not merely behavioral controls. They were keys to a program so deeply embedded that even the clones themselves were unaware of it. Every trooper, from the highest-ranking commander to the most inexperienced recruit, carried this silent command. It did not influence their actions in daily combat, nor did it disrupt their bonds with their Jedi generals. It waited, dormant, for the precise moment when it would activate and erase everything that had been built. The Jedi, with all their wisdom, never questioned the rapid emergence of an army tailored to their needs. The Council accepted the Republic's call to war without fully investigating where this force had come from. The Sith had ensured that all trails led to dead ends, all records carefully erased or rewritten. Even when anomalies appeared, clones like Fives who uncovered hints of the chip's true nature, the truth was systematically buried before it could reach the Council. Sidious had done more than prepare for war. He had constructed the means to end it in one stroke. The Jedi were so consumed by battle that they failed to see the foundation shifting beneath them. They had embraced the clone army as their allies, never realizing they were walking alongside their executioners. The war had forced them into a position where their own soldiers would be the ones to deliver the final blow. By the time the Jedi recognized the depth of the deception, it would be too late. The fate of their order had already been sealed. The Jedi and the clones marched side by side across the battlefields of the Clone Wars, bound by duty and shared struggle. For many Jedi, the clones were more than soldiers. They were comrades, even friends. They fought together, bled together, and in those moments between battles, they shared laughter and stories that made war seem distant, if only for a while. Life on the front lines was more than just tactical briefings and firefights. There were quiet moments in the barracks, times when Jedi and clones sat around rationed meals, exchanging thoughts on the war and the lives they might have had. Some Jedi, raised within the Order since childhood, found a kind of kinship in the clones, who had also been bred for a singular purpose. Their existence had been dictated by forces beyond their control, yet they had chosen to shape their own identities within those confines. Each clone was born from the same genetic code, yet no two were identical in spirit. Some developed distinct personalities, adopting nicknames that set them apart from the faceless legions they had been designed to be. They customized their armor, painted their helmets, and carved symbols onto their gear. Small acts of individuality that pushed back against the idea that they were merely copies of Jango Fett. Jedi like Anakin Skywalker and Plo Koon encouraged this, fostering a sense of brotherhood rather than strict command. For many, the Jedi were not just leaders. They were mentors, sometimes even family. That bond was strongest in battle. Jedi and clones saved each other's lives countless times, building trust through hardship. They relied on one another in the trenches of Umbara, the frozen wastelands of Orto-Plutonia, and the desert skirmishes of Geonosis. Each battle cemented that connection, proving that the war could not be won alone. There were Jedi who refused to see the clones as expendable, who mourned each loss as deeply as they would a fallen Padawan. For those clones, that recognition mattered. In a galaxy that had created them to be soldiers, someone saw them as more. But beneath the camaraderie, something unspoken lingered. The clones knew they were different. They aged at twice the normal rate, their entire existence structured around war. What happened when the war ended? That question went unanswered, hanging over them like an unfinished sentence. They were warriors without a future, fighting for a republic that had never decided what their place would be once peace was restored. Some accepted it. Others didn't let themselves think about it. And then there were the moments, subtle, fleeting, when a clone's hand would twitch near his blaster at an unexpected word, when an order from a Jedi would bring the slightest pause. Deep within them, something waited, something none of them understood. The bonds they had built, the trust they had formed, it was real, but so was the programming buried beneath it. When the moment came, when the hidden command was spoken, everything they had been would be stripped away in an instant. The Jedi never saw it coming. The clones never had a choice. The Clone Wars dominated every Senate meeting, every holo broadcast, every conversation in the Republic's highest halls. To the galaxy, it was a war of survival, a desperate struggle against the Separatist threat. To Darth Sidious, it was something else entirely. Each battle, each political maneuver, each crisis was another step toward the future he had crafted in secret. He did not merely wage war, he directed it from both sides, controlling the Republic while orchestrating the Separatist movement through his Sith apprentice Count Dooku. Dooku was a master manipulator, a former Jedi turned political idealist. He played his role perfectly, uniting disillusioned systems under the Confederacy of Independent Systems while ensuring the war remained unwinnable. He was the face of the enemy, the visible hand of the dark side that drew the Jedi deeper into conflict. But he was never meant to be the victor. He was a tool, no different than the battle droids he commanded. His fate had been decided long before the first shots of the war were fired. The Jedi, trapped in a war they did not start, found themselves unable to see the walls closing in. They had always distrusted the Sith, but they had never fought a war against an enemy they could not define. The Republic was changing around them. Palpatine's authority grew unchecked, his emergency powers renewed with every crisis. He stood before the Senate as the Republic's protector, offering stability in the face of war. And the Senate, desperate for leadership, gave him everything he asked for. The Jedi Council sensed the danger, but they were powerless to stop it. Every warning they voiced was dismissed as paranoia. Every attempt to curtail Palpatine's influence met with political resistance. The Chancellor had spent years building a reputation as a friend to the Jedi, a leader who respected their wisdom. But behind closed doors, he slowly turned the Republic against them. He planted the idea that they were too powerful, too detached, too willing to interfere in politics. At the same time, the war was bleeding the Jedi dry. There had once been thousands, but every battle took another master, another knight, another Padawan. The endless fighting was not just a necessity of war, it was a design. The Jedi Order was being weakened from within, its numbers whittled down to ensure that when the final betrayal came, there would be no one left to resist it. The clones were another piece of that plan. The Jedi saw them as allies, but to Palpatine, they were a weapon waiting to be activated. While the war raged, the inhibitor chips remained dormant, their purpose unknown to even the clones themselves. The Jedi thought they were leading the Republic's army. In reality, they were standing at the center of a trap that had been set long before the first battle of Geonosis. The stage was nearly set. The war had done its job, grinding the Jedi down and elevating Palpatine's influence to near total control. The Republic still believed it was fighting for democracy, but it had already become something else. It only needed one final push to transform into the Empire. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, the Jedi would never see it coming. The Republic's clone army was engineered to be the most disciplined, efficient fighting force the galaxy had ever seen. Each soldier was created from the genetic material of Jango Fett, trained from birth to follow orders without question, and conditioned to prioritize the Republic's interests above all else. But hidden beneath their loyalty, buried within their very biology, was something far more sinister. The inhibitor chips, small enough to go unnoticed in every medical scan, were the key to the greatest deception in galactic history. On the surface, these chips were explained away as safeguards. The Kaminoans, known for their mastery of genetic engineering, claimed they were a necessary measure to ensure the clones remained obedient. They spoke of them as behavioral regulation tools, designed to suppress any unpredictable aggression inherited from Jango Fett's DNA. The Jedi, already stretched thin by the war, never questioned it. Clones were bred to serve, and if a minor modification helped maintain order, then so be it. But this was a lie. The true purpose of the chips had nothing to do with behavioral control, and everything to do with control at the deepest level. They were not restraints to temper aggression. They were weapons, waiting for activation. Every clone, regardless of rank, carried this hidden command in their mind, a silent directive that could override their thoughts, instincts, and loyalties in an instant. The technology was flawless. The chips were biologically integrated, indistinguishable from natural brain tissue. They adapted seamlessly to each clone's neural patterns, ensuring that when the time came, activation would be absolute. There would be no hesitation, no awareness of external influence. The clones would not feel conflicted about what they were doing, because in that moment, they would believe they were acting of their own free will. For years, they fought alongside the Jedi, forming bonds of trust and camaraderie. They saved each other's lives on countless battlefields, shared stories around makeshift campfires, and mourned fallen brothers together. The Jedi saw the clones as individuals, not as a faceless army. Some Jedi even defied tradition, forming friendships with their troopers that went beyond command. And all the while, the hidden directive remained, dormant and undiscovered. The few who came close to uncovering the truth never lived long enough to warn the others. Clone Trooper Fives, one of the most determined soldiers to ever question his programming, came within reach of exposing the secret. He learned of the chips and their unnatural origin, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. The Jedi dismissed his claims as delusions, and before he could prove what he had discovered, he was silenced. The tragic irony was that the Jedi had been trained to sense deception, to read emotions, and detect hidden dangers. Yet the greatest threat to their survival was concealed within the very minds of those they trusted. When the command was given, it would not feel like treachery to the clones. It would feel like duty, and no bond, no act of friendship would be strong enough to stop what had already been programmed into them. The Clone Wars had waged for 3 relentless years, draining the Republic of its strength and scattering the Jedi across battlefronts spanning thousands of systems. But as the final days of the war approached, a shift in momentum became clear. The Separatists were faltering. Their fleets were in retreat, their droid armies collapsing under the weight of coordinated Republic offensives. After years of brutal conflict, the Jedi saw what they believed to be the light at the end of the tunnel. Across the Senate, Optimism grew. Victory seemed inevitable. Republic forces had driven the Separatists from key strongholds, and their leaders, Count Dooku and General Grievous, were on the run. Coruscant itself had come under direct attack in a desperate strike to capture Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, but even that had failed. The battle had left scars, but it had also reaffirmed the Republic's strength. The war was ending, and peace was finally within reach. On the battlefield, Jedi commanders felt the shift as well. Reports flooded in from across the Outer Rim. Droid legions deactivated without warning, Separatist warships abandoned in retreat, planetary governments surrendering outright. Some Jedi, hardened by years of war, remained cautious. Others allowed themselves to believe that they had won. The Order had paid a heavy price, but they had preserved the Republic. They had done what was necessary. But while the Jedi prepared for a Republic restored to peace, Palpatine consolidated the last pieces of his power. His emergency wartime authority had granted him sweeping control, and at first, the Senate had justified it as a necessity. But the war had twisted that necessity into something permanent. The Senate, battered by crisis after crisis, had grown accustomed to deferring to Palpatine's leadership. There were few who questioned why emergency powers had not yet been relinquished. Those who did were silenced by politics, coercion, or worse. Even within the Jedi Council there was uncertainty. The Order had long distrusted Palpatine's growing influence, but the war had left them vulnerable. They had always served the Republic, but now they were beginning to question whether the Republic still existed in the way they had once believed. There were whispered concerns about the Chancellor's refusal to relinquish command of the military, about his insistence on keeping the Jedi at the forefront of the war effort. Yet, they hesitated. The Jedi had spent years fighting for democracy. To accuse the Republic's leader of tyranny without proof would fracture what little stability remained. It was a false sense of security, one that Palpatine had cultivated carefully. He let the Republic believe the war was reaching its conclusion, while ensuring that the true battle had yet to begin. The Separatists had never been the real enemy, only a distraction to wear down the Jedi and reshape the Republic's foundations. The illusion of victory was his final move before the endgame. The Jedi had spent years bracing against external threats, but the greatest danger was already inside their ranks. They had fought to protect the Republic, never realizing that the Republic had already been remade in Palpatine's image. The Jedi thought they had survived the worst of the war. They were wrong. The final betrayal was coming, and there was nothing left to stop it. The Republic stood on the edge of transformation, though few understood just how close it was. The war had all but ended. The Separatist leadership had fractured, its fleets were in disarray, and its droid armies were no longer a match for the coordinated strength of the Republic's forces. But beneath the surface, something else was happening, something no one could see. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine had spent years expanding his influence, but in these final moments his control was absolute. The Senate had long since surrendered its authority, too weary from war to resist his commands. The Republic military, once a vast institution with independent oversight, now answered directly to him. The Jedi had fought to preserve democracy, only to watch it slip into the hands of a single ruler. The Jedi Council was restless. Doubt had crept into their discussions, growing into something impossible to ignore. The Chancellor had held emergency powers longer than any leader in history, and now he refused to give them up. The justification was always the same: stability. The war had not yet concluded. The Republic was still vulnerable, and only through his continued leadership could peace be ensured. Some Jedi were willing to believe that, others were not. Among those who questioned the Chancellor's authority, whispers of concern had become spoken warnings. Master Mace Windu was among the most vocal, urging the Council to act before it was too late. Yoda, though cautious, had also begun to sense the shifting tide. But there was no proof, no evidence to support the growing unease. And without proof, they were powerless to act. Anakin Skywalker, once the Jedi's greatest hope, had grown closer to Palpatine than anyone realized. His presence at the Chancellor's side was no longer occasional, it was expected. He was no longer merely a Jedi Knight. He had become an extension of Palpatine's will. The Council saw it, but they did not understand its full significance. They still believed Anakin could be reached. Across the galaxy, the clone legions remained on high alert. Their Jedi commanders received no orders to stand down, no signal that the war was nearing its end. The Republic's war machine continued, running on momentum alone. But the soldiers did not question it. They followed their generals into battle, obeyed orders without hesitation, and waited. For what, they did not know. For the Jedi, there was a sense that something was wrong, but the truth remained hidden. The Sith had always worked from the shadows, manipulating events without being seen. Now, they no longer needed to. The Republic was already theirs. The Jedi, once the guardians of peace, had become obstacles, and obstacles had to be removed. The moment was near. The pieces were in place. The Senate had been primed. The clones stood ready. The Jedi were vulnerable, scattered across distant battlefields, unprepared for the command that would change everything. The Republic still believed it was fighting its final battle against the Separatists, but its real war, the one that had been waged in secret, was about to end, and only one side would survive. The command was given with the calm certainty of a man who knew he had already won. From his office atop Coruscant's Senate District, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, now fully revealed as Darth Sidious, spoke the words that would reshape the galaxy. Execute Order 66. The transmission spread through the ranks of the Grand Army of the Republic in an instant. Encryption layers peeled away, revealing a command buried so deep in the clones' neural programming that not even the strongest of wills could resist it. The biochips activated across thousands of battlefields, sending a silent, invisible signal that seized control of the minds of millions. Across the galaxy, clone troopers turned their weapons on the Jedi they had fought beside for years. There was no hesitation, no warning, just the cold efficiency of programming overriding trust. On the bridge of a Republic warship, a Jedi general reviewed battle reports when his own guards raised their blasters and fired. On a jungle world, a Padawan leading a relief effort watched in confusion as her squad formed a firing line around her. In the mountains of Megiddo, Ki-Adi-Mundi charged forward in a final assault, only to realize too late that his men had stopped following, blasters now aimed at his back. Some Jedi fought back, deflecting bolts with instinct honed by years of war. But there was no coordination, no strategy to counter an attack they never expected. Others never had a chance. Their final moments were filled not with rage, but with disbelief. They had sensed no deception, no warning in the Force. Some of the most powerful Jedi felt the betrayal as a wave rippling through existence. Yoda, meditating on Kashyyyk, collapsed under the weight of it. His mind, connected deeply to the Force, was overwhelmed by the countless deaths occurring at once. It was a wound, one that carved through the very fabric of the galaxy. The Force itself recoiled. The clones executed their orders with military precision. Escape routes were blocked, communications were jammed, Jedi who tried to send distress calls found their transmissions intercepted. The clones knew their tactics, their movements, their weaknesses. The very things that had made them effective leaders in war had now become the reason their survival was impossible. On some worlds, civilians watched in horror as their supposed protectors were cut down in the streets, but no one moved to help. The clones, still wearing the colors of the Republic, had already begun pushing the new narrative. The Jedi were traitors, enemies of democracy. The message spread just as quickly as the Order itself. The Republic's guardians were falling, their numbers erased within hours. Those who survived would soon become fugitives in a galaxy that no longer saw them as protectors. Order 66 had not just begun a new era. It had ended everything the Jedi had ever stood for. Coruscant's skyline burned with the reflection of blaster fire as the attack began. The Jedi Temple, a towering monument to knowledge and peace, stood against the chaos until its own protectors turned against it. At the front of the assault marched Anakin Skywalker, no longer the Republic's hero, but something else entirely. Darth Vader. By his side, the 501st Legion moved with mechanical precision. These were not standard troops. They were veterans of countless battles, the elite of the Grand Army of the Republic. They had fought alongside Jedi generals, learned from them, adapted to their strategies. Now, that knowledge was being used against them. The outer gates fell within minutes. Temple guards, skilled warriors in their own right, barely slowed the advance. The clones knew their armor, their weaknesses, their formations. There was no resistance capable of holding them back. The vast halls, once filled with the voices of Jedi debating philosophy and teaching the next generation, echoed only with the sharp crack of blaster fire and the hum of Vader's lightsaber. In the archives, Jedi scholars desperately tried to preserve centuries of knowledge. Databanks were locked, holocrons hidden, but none of it would survive. The clones tore through the chamber with ruthless efficiency, erasing what they didn't understand and confiscating what they did. The Grand Holocron, an ancient repository of Jedi wisdom, was taken for the Emperor himself. Everything else was left to burn. Deep within the temple, a different kind of horror unfolded. The younglings, barely old enough to hold training sabers, had been ushered into hiding by their instructors. Some believed that the temple's walls would protect them. They were wrong. They saw their defender before they saw the danger. To them, Anakin Skywalker was a name of legend, the warrior who had saved the Republic time and again. They ran to him for protection, for answers. There was no hesitation in his response. His lightsaber ignited. Throughout the temple, Jedi fought and fell. Masters who had trained for decades were overwhelmed in moments. They had taught these clones how to fight, how to move, how to think on the battlefield. Every lesson had become a weakness, every tactic predictable. Above the temple, Coruscant's citizens watched the smoke rise. Some celebrated, believing the reports that the Jedi had betrayed the Republic. Others remained silent, uncertain. Those who had lived under the Jedi's protection struggled to accept the sight before them. The temple, once a beacon of stability, was being erased. By the time the battle ended, there was no resistance left. The Grand Temple doors remained open, its defenders cut down where they stood. The structure itself would remain, but its purpose had died. The Jedi Order had no center, no leadership, no future. The Republic had been built on their backs, and now it continued without them. The betrayal unfolded across the galaxy in perfect synchronization. Jedi, scattered across war-torn worlds, found themselves surrounded by the very soldiers they had fought beside. The transition was immediate. One moment they were generals leading their men into battle. The next, they were targets. On Maigito, Ki-Adi-Mundi led the charge across a crystalline bridge, his mind focused on breaking the Separatist defenses. His commandos flanked him, their movements coordinated, their firepower overwhelming. He had fought alongside these men through countless battles, but the weight of experience meant nothing when the order was given. Their blasters raised. He had only a second to react. His saber deflected the first shot, then the second. But there were too many. The bridge became his grave, his body falling among the shattered ice. On Felucia, the vibrant jungles provided no cover. Aayla Secura walked alongside the 327th Star Corps, unaware of the danger at her back. Commander Bly, a soldier who had sworn to protect her, received the transmission. It didn't take long. A single nod. The blaster fire started, and she barely turned before the first shot struck her. She collapsed, but the attack did not stop. The clones fired until there was no movement. The Jedi weren't the only ones caught in the fallout. Across the Republic, civilians watched the chaos unfold in real time. The Holonet, once a tool for Republic propaganda, became a weapon of control. Reports of Jedi treason flooded the airwaves. The temple on Coruscant had been cleansed to prevent a coup. The generals leading the war effort had turned against the Republic. Every broadcast followed the same script. Some believed it. Others knew better. On planets with strong Jedi ties, the reaction was immediate. Governments that had once welcomed Jedi as protectors now faced ultimatums: compliance or destruction. Those who refused to turn in survivors were treated as enemies of the state. Cities that had once been safe havens became occupied territories. Not everyone fell in line. Underground networks formed in the shadows, harboring those who had nowhere else to go. These weren't soldiers or rebels, just people unwilling to watch their protectors be slaughtered. Farmers on distant moons, dock workers in Republic spaceports, nobles who had once sought Jedi mediation, all of them faced the same choice: stand by or act. The cost of resistance was severe. Entire communities were purged for suspicion alone. Across the Outer Rim, the Separatists barely had time to react. Their war against the Republic had kept them blind to the shift in power. By the time they realized the Republic was gone, it was too late. The war had ended, but their worlds were now under Imperial control. The Republic had promised peace. The Empire delivered silence. The war had made them soldiers. The Order made them executioners. For the clones, loyalty had always been a defining trait. They were bred for it, trained to follow orders without hesitation. But something changed when the command came through. The inhibitor chips forced compliance, suppressing hesitation, overriding bonds that had been built over years of war. The transition was seamless for most. Blasters were raised, triggers pulled, and Jedi were cut down in a matter of seconds. But for some, something lingered beneath the surface. A voice buried under the programming, a fleeting thought of doubt. For Commander Cody, the shift happened instantly. He had served under General Kenobi through battle after battle. He had saved Kenobi's life, just as Kenobi had saved his. They weren't just commander and general, they were comrades. That didn't matter. The transmission came through, and within seconds, he gave the order. No hesitation, no second guessing. A blast from the artillery turret roared toward the Jedi he had fought beside for years. The logic in his mind was airtight. Kenobi had betrayed the Republic. That's what the voice in his head told him, and that voice left no room for argument. But as the moments passed, that certainty began to unravel. Kenobi had survived. That should have been a relief. a chance to correct the mistake. Instead, Cody felt nothing. The programming held firm, ensuring that regret never surfaced. The weight of what had happened wouldn't hit until later, long after the war had ended. By then, the damage was done. For Captain Rex, the conflict was immediate. He had fought beside Ahsoka Tano for years. She wasn't just his general, she was his friend. When the order came through, the chip took control, forcing him to raise his weapon. His body obeyed, but something inside fought back. It wasn't enough to resist, not at first. He managed only 2 words before the programming took over completely. Find fives. A desperate plea, the last act of a mind trying to fight against a command it didn't understand. Ahsoka had seen it in his eyes. The moment of struggle, the brief flicker of awareness. It was enough. She subdued him, removed his chip, and when he woke, the weight of what had happened came crashing down. He had nearly killed her. His men, the ones he had trusted, were still hunting her. And worst of all, he knew they weren't responsible. They had no choice. That was the tragedy of it all. The clones were both perpetrators and victims. They had followed orders, but the orders weren't theirs to question. The inhibitor chips ensured that even the strongest bonds were severed in an instant. Some clones, like Cody, would suppress the doubts, burying them under duty and protocol. Others, like Rex, would spend the rest of their lives haunted by what they had done. The Jedi had been wiped out. The Republic had become an empire, and the soldiers who had carried out the betrayal were left with nothing but silence. Order 66 had turned the galaxy into a death trap for the Jedi. Within hours, their sanctuaries became killing fields. Their allies became enemies. Their entire way of life was reduced to whispers and fading echoes. Those who survived had 2 choices: fight a battle they couldn't win, or disappear into the shadows. Obi-Wan Kenobi had spent years leading Republic forces, standing at the heart of the war, trusted by soldiers and revered by his peers. Now he was alone. He had barely escaped the firestorm on Utapau, his clone commander Cody turning on him without hesitation. The very troops he had fought beside were now hunting him down. But there was no time to grieve, no space to process the betrayal. He had one priority: returning to Coruscant, confirming what he already suspected. The truth was worse than he imagined. The Jedi Temple lay in ruins, the bodies of younglings littering the halls where they once trained. The Republic he had sworn to protect was gone, replaced by an empire forged in deceit. And Anakin, his brother, his greatest failure, had played a role in it all. There was nothing left to save. Kenobi and Yoda salvaged what they could, sending a final warning to any remaining Jedi. Stay away. The Republic has fallen. For many, staying away wasn't enough. The purge was relentless, stretching across thousands of systems. Jedi like Quinlan Vos, Ahsoka Tano, and Ferren Barr learned that survival wasn't just about avoiding detection. It was about adapting. The galaxy had turned hostile overnight, and the ones who had once been its greatest protectors were now hunted like criminals. But they weren't alone. In the Outer Rim, secret networks formed. Smugglers, senators, and everyday citizens took extraordinary risks to help Jedi escape. The paths were dangerous, the consequences severe, but resistance had already begun. Former allies like Bail Organa worked in the shadows, providing safe houses and resources. Refugees found their way to hidden enclaves, places like the hidden world of Jabiim, or deep within the ruins of fallen civilizations. Ahsoka, forced into exile, shed her Jedi identity completely. She moved through the underworld, relying on contacts from her past to navigate the chaos. The Empire's reach was absolute, but cracks existed, places where the light had not yet been extinguished. Those who knew her offered sanctuary, though few truly understood the weight of her loss. She had walked away from the Jedi before the war ended, yet here she was, hunted all the same. For others, survival required sacrifice. Kanan Jarrus, once known as Caleb Dume, buried his past completely. He discarded his lightsaber, masked his presence in the Force, and lived as a wanderer, avoiding anything that might reveal his true identity. Trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. What the Empire didn't account for was that the Jedi were more than an order. They were an idea, a belief that would not die so easily. The war had broken them. Order 66 had shattered them. But even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, embers of resistance still burned. The Jedi were not yet extinct. The Jedi Purge did not end with Order 66. It was merely the beginning. The clones had carried out their duty with ruthless efficiency, but there were always survivors. The Emperor knew that scattered Jedi, even in hiding, could become symbols of resistance. He needed something more permanent, something more insidious, to ensure their destruction. The Inquisitorius was born out of this necessity. Palpatine and his new apprentice Darth Vader understood that to eliminate the Jedi entirely, brute force alone would not be enough. Survivors would adapt, change their tactics, and conceal themselves within the masses. They needed hunters. Not just any hunters, those who could sense Jedi through the Force, track them across planets, and break them both physically and psychologically. The answer was cruelly poetic. Turn Jedi against their own. Former Jedi, captured, broken, and reshaped into something unrecognizable, became the first Inquisitors. They were no longer guardians of peace, no longer bound by the code they once swore to uphold. Under Vader's brutal tutelage, they learned new ways to wield the Force, not as a tool for balance, but as a weapon of fear. Their lightsabers, now distinct with rotating crimson blades, symbolized their complete allegiance to the Empire. Each one was given a number, their past names erased. Their training was not just about combat. The Emperor and Vader understood that a Jedi's greatest weapon was their resilience. To truly destroy them, the hunt needed to be more than physical. It had to be psychological. The Inquisitors were taught to exploit weaknesses, to manipulate emotions, to turn hope into despair. Some, like the Grand Inquisitor, had once been esteemed Jedi temple guards. Now he relished the hunt, his past life a distant memory. Others, like the former Padawan known as the Second Sister, had been betrayed by their own kind and remade into something cold and vengeful. The methods used by the Inquisitorius were unlike anything the Jedi had encountered before. They did not simply strike from the shadows. They dismantled their prey piece by piece. They sowed rumors, turned allies against their targets, infiltrated underground networks. When they found Jedi, they rarely killed them outright. First, they made them suffer. A captured Jedi would endure relentless torment, their will eroded through pain and deception. Some broke. Others were given a choice, death or service. The Inquisitorius always welcomed new recruits. For Jedi in hiding, this new threat was something far worse than clones with blasters. The Inquisitors were relentless, their presence a constant shadow. They moved through the outer rim, tearing through safe houses, following the faintest traces of Force activity. Now, staying hidden required more than caution. It required complete abandonment of everything that once defined a Jedi. Vader oversaw their missions personally. To him, the hunt was more than duty. It was personal. Every Jedi he destroyed was another reminder of the past he had buried. His presence among the Inquisitors was not just for command. He wanted them to understand what it truly meant to fall, to erase who they once were, to know that there was only power, and those too weak to take it deserved their fate. The purge had begun with an order. Now, it continued as a whisper. The Jedi who survived had one reality. They were being hunted, and their hunters knew them better than anyone. The Jedi Order had been exterminated, but the war against them did not end with their deaths. A corpse was not enough. Their very existence had to be erased, rewritten into something grotesque and treasonous. The galaxy had long revered the Jedi as noble defenders of peace, but Palpatine knew that such admiration, if left unchecked, could fester into doubt. Survivors might rise as symbols, martyrs might be remembered, rebellion might find its roots in their legend. The solution was methodical: transform the Jedi from fallen heroes into enemies of the Republic, traitors whose removal had been a necessary act of preservation. It was not enough to eliminate them physically. Their memory itself had to be corrupted. The Empire began its grand cover-up. The propaganda machine moved swiftly. The Emperor's address to the Senate, delivered in the wake of Order 66, laid the foundation. He spoke with solemn authority, his voice layered with the weight of tragedy and necessity. The Jedi had betrayed the Republic, he declared. They had conspired against the government they once served, launching an attempted coup to seize control. He portrayed them as dangerous, their arrogance having led them to believe they were above the very democracy they claimed to protect. Their destruction was not an act of tyranny. It was justice. The rebranding of the Jedi was insidious. Public records were altered. Holonet broadcasts flooded the systems, reinforcing the new narrative. Carefully curated footage showed Jedi igniting their weapons within the Senate chamber, an edited version of the real confrontation between Mace Windu and Palpatine. Their acts of heroism in the Clone Wars were twisted, their leadership framed as reckless warmongering rather than selfless service. Their deaths were presented as a relief, a final end to their corruption. The message was clear: the galaxy was safer without them. Even those who had once trusted the Jedi found themselves questioning their own memories. The Jedi had always been secretive, had they not? They had wielded powers beyond ordinary beings, answered only to their own council, operated apart from the Senate's oversight. The Republic had fought to protect democracy, yet the Jedi had held positions of military leadership. The subtle manipulation worked. Citizens who had once relied on the Jedi for protection began to accept the narrative, or at least found it easier to look away. The purge extended beyond physical extermination. Jedi temples were dismantled, their archives confiscated, their sacred sites desecrated. The great Jedi library, once a beacon of knowledge, was sealed. Any mention of the Jedi Order in history books was removed or rewritten. Even planetary governments who had once allied with the Jedi quickly distanced themselves, eager to prove their loyalty to the Empire. For those who still whispered of the Jedi, a new warning loomed. Association with the Fallen Order meant death. Any suspected sympathizers were arrested, interrogated, and in many cases, executed. The Jedi had always believed in the power of the Force, but Palpatine understood something greater: the power of perception. He did not need to erase the Jedi completely. He only needed to ensure that when they were spoken of with fear, contempt, or in time, as little more than forgotten myths. The Galactic Senate had long stood as a beacon of democracy, a sprawling assembly where representatives from thousands of worlds gathered to govern through debate and legislation. It had endured for millennia, weathering conflicts, political corruption, and internal strife. But all institutions, no matter how vast, could be reshaped under the right conditions. By the time Palpatine declared himself Emperor, the Senate had already surrendered the Republic's future. The shift was not immediate. It did not come with the thunderous applause that had greeted the formation of the Empire, nor with the sweeping reforms that followed Order 66. Instead, it was a slow, insidious erosion. Senators who had once been vocal opponents of executive overreach found themselves silenced, some through political maneuvering, others through quiet disappearances. Those who remained either embraced the new order or convinced themselves that compliance was the only path forward. Palpatine had mastered the art of control through legitimacy. Every decree was wrapped in the language of necessity. The Jedi had been traitors. The war had exposed weaknesses in the Republic's structure, and stability required strength. The Senate, already conditioned by years of emergency powers granted during the Clone Wars, rubber-stamped every new measure. Laws centralizing authority under the Emperor were passed with overwhelming support. Opposition was painted as disloyalty. The military became the Empire's spine. The Grand Army of the Republic had fought to defend democracy, but in its rebranding as the Imperial military, it became the instrument of suppression. Clones, once seen as heroes, patrolled the streets of former Republic strongholds with the cold efficiency of enforcers rather than protectors. Recruitment shifted toward non-clone personnel as academies across the galaxy trained officers in the doctrine of absolute loyalty. Planetary governments, once afforded relative autonomy under the Republic, now operated under the watchful eye of regional governors appointed directly by the Emperor. The Senate still existed, but its function became largely ceremonial. Representatives could speak, could debate, but true power no longer rested within their chambers. Decisions were made elsewhere, dictated by those whose allegiance lay solely with the new regime. The transition was seamless for many citizens. The war had exhausted them. The endless battles, the economic instability, the fear of invasion, it had all taken its toll. For those who had never known life beyond the Republic, the promise of order and security was enough. Imperial rule, at least on the surface, meant stability. Trade routes reopened, crime syndicates were crushed under the new military presence, and entire sectors saw economic growth under strict imperial oversight. To the average citizen, the Republic had not truly died. It had simply evolved into something stronger. But strength came at a cost. Freedoms that had once been taken for granted, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, the right to question authority, began to fade. Dissent became treason. Criticism of the Empire was met with swift and brutal consequences. Citizens who had once trusted in the Republic's institutions found themselves under the gaze of an empire that no longer needed their approval. The Republic had not been overthrown in a single night. It had not fallen to an invading force or collapsed under external pressure. It had been dismantled piece by piece, transformed in full view of its people. By the time they realized what had happened, it was already too late. The Jedi had not been a myth or a distant legend. They had walked among the people of the galaxy, fought alongside them, healed their wounded, and brought stability where chaos threatened to take root. When Order 66 swept across the stars, their loss was felt not just by those who wielded the Force, but by entire civilizations. In the days and weeks that followed, a strange silence fell over the galaxy, a mourning period for a people who had once stood as the keepers of peace. On countless worlds, shrines and temples once dedicated to the Jedi were abandoned or destroyed. Those that remained became sites of quiet tribute. On planets where Jedi had saved entire populations from war or disaster, Citizens whispered their names in defiance of Imperial orders. Some left offerings at the ruins of old temples, while others refused to speak of the Jedi at all, fearful of the Empire's spies. Even those who had never encountered a Jedi felt their absence, as if a stabilizing force had been stripped from the galaxy. Among the religious and spiritual sects that had long revered the Jedi as emissaries of the Force, the grief ran deeper. To many, the Order's destruction was not just political, but cosmic. The Jedi had embodied balance, and their extermination signaled something far more troubling than a shift in governance. In the Outer Rim, mystics spoke of a disturbance, a darkness spreading unseen. Monks on Jeddah meditated in solemn silence, while the Church of the Force, once a fringe belief, saw its ranks swell with those who refused to accept the official narrative. The Force, many believed, had been wounded. For generations, the Jedi had stood as symbols of hope. Their absence left an undeniable void, and in that void, fear took root. Entire species that had once relied on the Order's protection now found themselves vulnerable. The Togruta of Shili, who had seen Jedi stand between them and slavers, grieved the loss of their defenders. The Wookiees of Kashyyyk, whose ties to the Jedi stretched back centuries, watched in horror as Imperial forces took control of their homeworld. The Twi'leks, who had fought side by side with Jedi generals during the Clone Wars, whispered their names in sorrow. Even those who had once resented the Jedi's influence felt the weight of their absence. The smugglers and spice runners who had evaded Jedi patrols, the corrupt officials who had feared their interference, and the warlords who had fought against their authority, each found the new order more brutal than they had expected. The Empire's iron grip tightened, and where the Jedi had once wielded wisdom and restraint, stormtroopers enforced loyalty through fear. As years passed, the memory of the Jedi became distorted. The Empire's relentless propaganda reshaped history, framing the Jedi as traitors who had nearly destroyed the Republic. Yet on the fringes of the galaxy, in quiet corners untouched by Imperial reach, their true legacy endured. In hidden journals, whispered stories, and the hearts of those who had once fought beside them, the Jedi remained. Their fall was a wound that would not heal, a reminder that the galaxy had lost something irreplaceable. The war had ended, but for the clones, peace never came. The same soldiers who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the Jedi now found themselves adrift in an empire that no longer had a use for them. Designed for battle, programmed for loyalty, and forced to execute an order they did not fully understand, they were left to bear the weight of actions they could not take back. The inhibitor chips had robbed them of choice, but not of memory. And for many, memory was the cruelest punishment of all. Some convinced themselves that what they had done was necessary, that the Jedi had truly been traitors, that the Republic had needed purging to survive. But deep down, there were cracks. The bonds formed during the war did not dissolve so easily, and doubt gnawed at the edges of their minds. They had fought alongside Jedi for years, trusted them, bled for them. To turn on them in a heartbeat, without warning, without hesitation, something about it felt wrong. Yet questioning their orders was not something they had ever been trained to do. For many clones, the burden was not just emotional but physical. Their genetic modifications, once seen as enhancements, became a curse. They aged at twice the rate of a normal human, their bodies breaking down far sooner than nature intended. Where once they had stood as the Republic's finest, now they were aging relics in an empire that saw them as expendable. New stormtroopers, non-clones, conscripted from across the galaxy, began to take their place. The transition was swift, brutal. Many clones found themselves reassigned to lesser roles, forced into early retirement, or outright discarded. The ones who remained in the Empire's service watched as their ranks dwindled. Brothers they had fought beside began disappearing, their usefulness exhausted. Some took their own lives, unable to reconcile the weight of their actions. Others deserted, vanishing into the outer rim, hoping to escape the ghosts that followed them. Those who spoke out against the Empire did not last long. The Empire had no patience for soldiers with a conscience. For clones like Commander Cody, the war never truly ended. He had been the one to turn his blaster on Obi-Wan Kenobi, the general he had fought alongside for years. And yet, after executing Order 66, he had not felt victory, only an emptiness he could not name. The war had been their purpose. Without it, what were they? Even Captain Rex, one of the few to resist the chip's programming, carried scars that would never heal. He had witnessed firsthand the agony of his brothers, their minds hijacked, their free will stripped away. He had been forced to fight the very men he had once called family. And while he had survived, survival did not bring peace. The clones had been bred for war, but war had abandoned them. They had followed orders, done what they were made to do. But when the blasters fell silent, all that remained was regret. The Republic was gone. The Jedi were gone. And soon the clones themselves would be nothing more than another casualty of the Empire's ambition. The Jedi Temple was not just a sanctuary for warriors and scholars. It was a vault of history, a reservoir of knowledge stretching back thousands of years. Within its halls, Holocrons, crystalline data storage devices infused with the wisdom of Jedi Masters, contained the Order's greatest teachings. These artifacts held battle strategies, philosophies, techniques for communing with the Force, and even forbidden knowledge of the Sith. The Temple's archives, tended by the diligent Gate Master Jocasta Nu, had preserved generations of Jedi wisdom. But when the Empire took control, it was not enough to destroy the Jedi physically. Their very legacy had to be erased. Under orders from Emperor Palpatine, elite Imperial squads and the newly formed Inquisitorius were tasked with the systematic seizure and eradication of Jedi knowledge. Holocrons were collected en masse, their secrets picked apart by Sith scholars. Anything that could be used to strengthen Imperial rule was repurposed, twisted into tools of control. Holocrons containing ancient battle meditation techniques, advanced lightsaber forms, and healing arts were locked away deep within the Emperor's personal archives. Others, especially those containing wisdom about the light side, were outright destroyed. Palpatine understood something the Jedi had failed to grasp. Knowledge was power, and power unchecked was a threat. He could not afford a future where survivors rediscovered their teachings, where hidden Jedi rose to challenge his reign. So, the purge extended beyond the temples of Coruscant. Across the galaxy, remnants of the Jedi's influence were uprooted. Secret meditation chambers on Jeddah, long-forgotten shrines on Ilum, even personal collections held by scholars sympathetic to the Jedi cause, none were safe. A handful of Jedi foresaw this assault on knowledge and took desperate measures. Some, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, chose exile, safeguarding their wisdom in memories rather than written form. Yoda retreated into the depths of Dagobah, taking nothing with him but the teachings he had internalized over centuries. Others, like Quinlan Vos, operated in the shadows, smuggling artifacts to trusted allies who could hide them. And then there were those who fought, refusing to surrender even a fragment of Jedi history. Jocasta Nu, the former temple archivist, embarked on a personal crusade. Knowing the Empire would burn everything in its path, she sought to preserve what she could. With stolen records, she established a hidden archive, determined to pass on knowledge to a future generation of Force wielders. Her defiance would cost her dearly, but her sacrifice ensured that not all Jedi wisdom was lost. The loss of the Holocrons had consequences far beyond the immediate purge. Future generations of Force users would struggle to recover the knowledge of their predecessors. Lightsaber construction, Force healing, advanced telekinesis, skills that once flourished in the Jedi Order became myths and rumors. The Sith had not just won the war on the battlefield, they had rewritten history itself, leaving the galaxy in a darkness where only they understood the full extent of the Force's power. The fall of the Jedi was not just a victory for the Sith, it was a moment Palpatine intended to immortalize. The Republic had been cast aside, its ashes swept away to make room for the Galactic Empire. To cement his absolute rule and rewrite the history of the Jedi as traitors, the newly declared Emperor orchestrated a grand celebration, Empire Day. What was once a day of galactic unity under the Republic was now repurposed into a spectacle of power, a reminder to all that the Empire had triumphed. The first Empire Day took place mere weeks after the Jedi Purge. Massive rallies spread across Coruscant, with towering banners bearing the Imperial insignia. Propaganda flooded the holonet, glorifying the glorious rise of Palpatine's rule and the elimination of what the state now called the Jedi insurrection. Footage of the Jedi Temple in flames became a triumphant image, not one of sorrow but of order being restored. On the surface, Empire Day was a time of grand festivities. Fireworks lit the skies, and military parades showcased legions of stormtroopers marching in perfect unison. Entire cities were draped in Imperial colors. In the core worlds, the celebration felt almost jubilant. Citizens cheered as Palpatine gave his first public speech since declaring himself Emperor. Yet beneath the surface, it was a display built on fear. Attendance was mandatory in many sectors. Those who did not stand in forced admiration risked being reported to Imperial authorities. Dissenters were quietly removed, their voices erased before they could ever reach an audience. In the Outer Rim, where the Empire's reach was still solidifying, the reaction was more complicated. On some planets, especially those devastated by the Clone Wars, Empire Day brought a strange sense of relief. The war was over. The fighting had ceased. For those too weary to question the cost of peace, the Empire's rule felt preferable to the endless bloodshed they had endured. But for others, especially those who had seen the Jedi as protectors, Empire Day was a grotesque mockery. The twisted irony of Empire Day was that it celebrated an event most of the galaxy didn't fully understand. The true nature of the Jedi Purge, the betrayal, the executions, the programmed slaughter, was obscured beneath layers of deception. Few knew that the clones had been manipulated, that Order 66 was not an act of treason, but a silent massacre orchestrated from within. The Empire ensured that only one version of history remained. The Jedi had attempted a coup, and the Emperor had saved the Republic from their corruption. As the years passed, Empire Day became more than just a holiday. It became a tool, a reminder that the Empire was eternal, that its rule was unchallenged. With every parade, every grand speech, and every public execution of lingering Jedi survivors, the message was reinforced. The past was dead, the Republic was gone, and no one, not even the Jedi, could change that. With the Republic dismantled and the Jedi erased, Palpatine turned his attention to securing his rule for generations to come. The execution of Order 66 had removed a direct threat, but control could not be maintained through fear alone. The Emperor understood that the true key to longevity was reshaping the minds of the young. Through the Imperial Academy and state-controlled education, he set in motion the most insidious part of his plan: indoctrination. From childhood, students across the galaxy were exposed to a carefully rewritten history. The Republic's failures were exaggerated, its decline blamed on corruption and the so-called Jedi conspiracy. The Jedi were no longer protectors of peace, but war-hungry extremists who had attempted to overthrow democracy. The Clone Wars, in this version of history, had been a necessary conflict, one that proved the galaxy required the firm hand of the Empire to remain stable. The Republic was depicted as weak, fractured by bureaucracy, and incapable of governing itself. The Jedi, once revered as guardians of peace, were cast as arrogant deceivers who had endangered civilization. The Imperial Academy played a central role in this new order. Once a system designed to train officers for the Republic Navy, it was restructured to serve the Empire's needs. Here, young cadets learned more than combat tactics and starship navigation. They were trained in unquestioning loyalty. Uniformity was paramount. Individual thought was discouraged, independent reasoning seen as weakness. The curriculum reinforced the glory of imperial rule, the necessity of military strength, and the treachery of rebellion. Those who performed well were rewarded, elevated into elite ranks. Those who questioned the system were either reconditioned or quietly discarded. Propaganda was not confined to the academies. State-controlled holodramas, news reports, and public speeches reinforced the same message. Every planetary broadcast carried carefully crafted content designed to shape perception. The mere mention of Jedi in casual conversation became risky. Books, records, and artifacts from the Republic era were destroyed or censored. Those who had lived through the Clone Wars were silenced, their memories gradually overwritten by the narrative the Empire dictated. Beyond the formal institutions, the suppression of dissent became standard practice. Entire planets were placed under surveillance. Informants were embedded in communities. Families were encouraged to report any suspicious activity, even among their own. The concept of free thought eroded under the weight of constant imperial oversight. A single act of defiance could result in swift, merciless punishment. To resist was to disappear. Yet there were those who saw through the deception. Former Republic officers, civilians who had known Jedi personally, those who had experienced the Clone Wars firsthand, they knew the truth. But knowledge alone was dangerous. Speaking out meant exile or death. They became relics of a forgotten era, whispering their warnings in secret, hoping that one day the veil of imperial lies would be lifted. For now, however, the Empire held the future in its grip. A new generation was being shaped, molded into citizens who would never question, never resist. The Emperor's doctrine had ensured that loyalty would not need to be enforced by blasters alone. His greatest weapon was the minds of those who had never known anything different. The Clone Wars had reshaped the galaxy, but it was Order 66 that ensured its wounds would never fully heal. Across the stars, entire planetary systems bore the scars of the Jedi Purge, not only in the loss of life, but in the very fabric of their societies. For many, the fall of the Jedi was the moment hope itself collapsed. Worlds that had once flourished under the protection of the Jedi found themselves vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. The sudden eradication of the Order left entire sectors defenseless, their peacekeepers gone overnight. Where Jedi had once mediated disputes, Imperial governors now ruled through fear. Where Jedi had once fought to protect the innocent, stormtroopers now enforced silence. The void left behind was not just felt, it was exploited. The war economy, once driven by the Republic's desperate need for supplies, did not disappear with the end of the Clone Wars. Instead, it transformed. Shipbuilders, weapons manufacturers, and logistics firms that had thrived during the conflict now found themselves serving a new master. The Empire's demand for military infrastructure far surpassed anything the Republic had required, and those willing to align themselves with Imperial rule saw vast profits. Wealth consolidated into fewer hands, and those who resisted were swiftly removed from power. For the common people, life became harder. The Senate still existed in name, but true governance had been stripped away. Laws that once protected individual freedoms were quietly rewritten, replaced by directives that prioritized control above all else. Entire planetary economies were forcibly integrated into the Empire's supply chain, fueling its endless expansion. Trade routes that had once carried goods between independent systems now funneled resources directly to Imperial strongholds. Those who could not adapt were left to wither. Even beyond the political and economic shifts, something deeper had been lost: belief. For centuries, the Jedi had been a symbol of justice, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there were those who stood against tyranny. Their destruction sent a message that no one was beyond the reach of the Empire. Those who had once looked to the Jedi for guidance now lived in fear, uncertain of who could be trusted. Entire generations would grow up never knowing what it had meant to live under the Republic. But even in the wake of destruction, seeds of rebellion began to take root. The brutality of Imperial rule was not forgotten, nor was the betrayal of the Jedi. Survivors, soldiers, politicians, civilians began to whisper among themselves, sharing stories of what had been lost. Smugglers and mercenaries, once neutral in the galaxy's conflicts, found themselves drawn into the struggle. Former Republic loyalists, those who had seen firsthand what the Empire had become, refused to fade into the background. The scars of Order 66 ran deep, but scars were more than wounds. They were reminders. Reminders of what had been taken, of what had been destroyed. And for those who still believed in freedom, they were reminders of what needed to be fought for. The Empire had won the war, but beneath its iron grip, the embers of resistance smoldered, waiting for the right moment to ignite. The Empire had won. Order 66 had ensured that any who opposed its rise were either dead or in hiding. The Republic was gone, its democratic ideals swept away by the weight of Imperial rule. Now, across the stars, the age of oppression took hold. To most, these were simply known as the Dark Times, a period where resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. Under Palpatine's rule, fear became the foundation of control. The Imperial military presence expanded into every sector, ensuring that no planet was beyond its reach. Stormtroopers patrolled city streets, scanning for signs of sedition. Informants thrived, turning in friends, neighbors, and even family members in exchange for favor. The Senate still met, but its authority had been reduced to little more than a performance, a spectacle to maintain the illusion that the people still had a voice. In reality, all decisions were made by the Emperor and his closest advisors, with Grand Moff Tarkin and Darth Vader among the enforcers of this new reality. Dissent was not tolerated. Any who spoke against the Empire quickly disappeared, some taken in the dead of night, others made examples of in public displays of power. Entire planetary uprisings were crushed before they could even begin. On Ryloth, the Twi'lek resistance faced overwhelming military might. On Kashyyyk, Wookiee warriors fought desperately to defend their homeworld, only to be enslaved by Imperial forces. The remains of the Separatist movement, leaderless and disorganized, attempted brief resurgences, but without the strength to stand alone, they were swiftly eradicated. The message was clear. There was no Republic to save them, no Jedi to intervene. For the ordinary citizen, survival meant compliance. Many accepted Imperial rule, not out of loyalty, but because there was no other choice. Some thrived in the new order, adapting to its demands and reaping the benefits of unquestioning obedience. For others, the weight of subjugation was suffocating. Those who had once believed in the Republic struggled to find purpose in a galaxy where hope had been extinguished. But even in these bleakest of times, defiance still flickered in the shadows. Scattered remnants of the Republic's military refused to surrender, operating in secret from hidden bases. Smugglers and mercenaries, long accustomed to the dangers of the Outer Rim, began aiding those who sought escape from the Empire's grasp. Jedi survivors, few as they were, remained on the run, their names whispered like ghosts among those who still remembered what they once stood for. These early sparks of rebellion were small, barely noticeable against the vast machinery of Imperial dominance. A stolen weapons cache here, a sabotaged supply line there. But to those who resisted, each act of defiance was a declaration that the war was not truly over. Across the galaxy, those who had lost everything slowly began to realize that they were not alone. The Jedi were gone, but their legacy remained in the hearts of those who refused to bow. The Empire had declared an age of absolute rule, but rebellion had not been crushed. It had only begun. The Jedi Order had been shattered, its temples destroyed, its history erased, and its members hunted to near extinction. Yet despite all of this, the Jedi were never truly gone. In the ashes of their downfall, fragments of their teachings endured. Scattered across the galaxy, those who survived carried with them the wisdom of the Force, determined to preserve the ideals that had guided them for centuries. For some, survival meant exile. Obi-Wan Kenobi, once a general of the Clone Wars, became a hermit on the desert world of Tatooine, watching over the child who represented the last hope for the Jedi's return. Yoda, the Grand Master of the Order, retreated to the swamps of Dagobah, far from the reach of the Empire, where the dark side's presence masked his own. These were not acts of surrender, but of strategy. The Jedi's destruction had been swift and total, but rebuilding would require patience. The few who remained knew they could not fight the Empire as they once had. Others took a different path. Some Jedi survivors refused to accept hiding as their only option. Instead, they sought to pass on their knowledge in secrecy. Throughout the Outer Rim, whispers spread of masters training new apprentices in hidden enclaves, ensuring the ways of the Force would not be lost forever. These teachings did not follow the rigid structure of the old Jedi Order, nor could they. In the age of the Empire, learning the ways of the Force was a matter of survival, not tradition. Even among those who had never wielded a lightsaber, the Jedi's influence lingered. Refugees who had once been protected by the Order, diplomats who had seen their wisdom, and scholars who had studied their teachings all played a role in preserving their philosophy. Across the galaxy, coded messages and forgotten texts were quietly stored away, waiting for a future where they could be studied once more. The Empire sought to erase the Jedi, but knowledge was a difficult thing to destroy completely. Palpatine understood this, which is why his hunt for Jedi survivors never truly ended. The Inquisitors, trained in the dark side, scoured the galaxy, searching for any sign of lingering Jedi influence. Those who had hidden holocrons, books, or artifacts were branded as traitors. Even those who simply spoke of the Jedi in too favorable a light could find themselves arrested, or worse. But for every archive the Empire burned, another was secretly safeguarded. The Jedi's legacy was not contained to temples or doctrines. It existed in the minds of those who remembered them. The war against the Jedi had been fought with blasters and deception, but their survival would be fought with patience and persistence. Their presence in the galaxy was a whisper, but it was enough. So long as the idea of the Jedi remained, so long as their teachings were passed from one to another, the Order was never truly gone. The Empire had crushed them, but it had not broken them. The Jedi's time would come again. The fall of Anakin Skywalker was not just the end of a Jedi, it was the birth of something far worse. When Darth Vader emerged from the fires of Mustafar, he was more than a Sith Lord. He was a force of vengeance, a shadow of rage encased in armor. The Jedi were gone, but his hunt had only just begun. For him, survival was not enough. The survivors had to be erased. Vader was the Empire's enforcer, a figure whispered about in fear across the galaxy. He did not rule from a throne, nor did he make grand speeches like his master. His presence alone was enough. To the officers of the Imperial Navy, he was a symbol of unwavering obedience. To the hunted Jedi, he was the specter of death. Where Inquisitors failed, Vader would finish the job. There was no escape from him, no bargaining, no mercy. He carried out the Emperor's will with relentless precision, tracking down those who had escaped the initial purge. Some Jedi had abandoned the fight, hoping to fade into obscurity, but it never mattered. If there was even a rumor of their survival, Vader would find them. He did not hesitate. He did not allow them a final plea. He cut them down, one by one, not just to serve the Empire, but to silence what remained of the man he had once been. There was something personal in his crusade. For every Jedi he executed, there was an unspoken truth. He was not just destroying the Order, he was punishing himself. Anakin Skywalker had once fought beside these warriors, called them brothers and sisters. Now he was the one responsible for their annihilation. It was a reality he buried beneath brutality. If there was any pain left in him, it was locked behind the mask. He became something more than a Sith Lord. He was a nightmare made real. Entire systems fell silent at the mere mention of his name. When he walked onto a battlefield, opposition crumbled. The last Jedi who dared to stand against him learned the true weight of their failure. His power was unrelenting, his strikes precise, his presence suffocating. There was no room for resistance when Vader arrived. And yet, for all his fury, there was an emptiness beneath the terror. Every strike of his lightsaber, every act of destruction, was an echo of the past he could never outrun. He was no longer a Jedi, but neither was he fully Sith. He was something in between, a void filled with anger, loss, and regret, but with no path to redemption. The galaxy feared Darth Vader, but few understood the truth. He was not just the Emperor's enforcer, he was the product of Palpatine's ultimate manipulation. He had been forged in fire, molded in hatred, but underneath it all, something still lingered. It was buried beneath pain, beneath the armor, beneath the destruction he had caused. The question was whether he would ever acknowledge it, or if he would drown in the darkness he had embraced. The Jedi were gone, but the Force had not disappeared. Across the galaxy, echoes of it remained, hidden beneath the weight of Imperial rule. It was no longer spoken of openly. Where once the Jedi had been symbols of peace, they were now specters of treason, their teachings erased from public memory. The few who still felt the Force stirring within them were forced into silence. To be discovered meant death, or worse. For those born with an innate connection to the Force, life had become a delicate balance between survival and secrecy. Parents who once would have celebrated a child's unusual gifts now viewed them with fear. Stories spread quickly of Imperial officers arriving in the night, of children vanishing without explanation, of whispers that they had been taken somewhere beyond the reach of their families. Many never returned. Some families fled to the farthest reaches of the Outer Rim, believing that distance could shield them from the Emperor's grasp. But the Inquisitors were relentless. Their task was not only to hunt Jedi, but to ensure that no new generation would rise to replace them. Even those who had never been trained, those who had never seen a lightsaber, found themselves hunted if their abilities manifested in ways too obvious to ignore. Yet despite the danger, there were those who refused to let the Force die. Scattered pockets of knowledge persisted in the shadows. A handful of Jedi Holocrons, saved from destruction, passed between trusted hands. Ancient texts, once displayed in grand temples, now lay hidden beneath floorboards or buried in caves. Former Jedi, broken and weary, took on the role of silent guardians, teaching what little they could to those who sought understanding. The Force itself became a whispered legend, a fading ember that refused to be extinguished. On distant worlds, traditions that had existed long before the Jedi endured. The Night Sisters of Dathomir had their own ways of wielding power, far removed from the teachings of the Order. The Lasats, once devastated by Imperial conquest, still spoke of the Ashla, their own understanding of the Force. Even the Guardians of the Wills, stripped of their sacred duty on Jeddah, carried forward fragments of knowledge. The Empire had declared war on the Force, but its reach was not absolute. There was a cruel irony in the Empire's pursuit of total control. The harder it pressed down, the more resistance it created. Every child who was hidden, every secret lesson passed down in the dark, was an act of defiance. The Jedi had been scattered, but their influence had not been erased. It lingered in forgotten places, waiting. The Force could not be destroyed. It was patient. It was everywhere. And one day, when the time was right, it would rise again. The clone troopers had been designed for obedience, engineered to follow orders without question. For years, they had fought beside the Jedi, earning their trust, forging bonds in the fires of war. Then, with a single command, they turned their weapons on their closest allies. Yet, not all clones were blind to what had happened. Some felt the weight of their actions pressing down on them, an unbearable burden that no amount of programming could erase. For a select few, the inhibitor chips had failed to fully suppress their awareness. These clones, though small in number, struggled against the tide of Imperial control. Some, like Captain Rex, removed their chips before the command could take full effect. Others resisted in quieter ways, deliberately missing their shots, hesitating in the face of a Jedi's plea, creating moments of escape that saved lives. But such defiance came at a cost. Any clone who openly questioned Order 66 was branded a traitor, hunted down as ruthlessly as the Jedi themselves. In the years that followed, some clones sought atonement in their own ways. Cut Lorquain, a former soldier who had abandoned the war long before the Purge, lived a quiet life on a distant farm, shielding his family from the grip of the Empire. Others, like Gregor and Wolf, lived in the shadows, disconnected from their pasts, but never fully escaping the echoes of what they had done. Some, though, refused to run. As the rebellion began to form, it was joined by a surprising number of clones. These were the ones who could not ignore the truth of what they had been forced to do. They saw the Empire for what it was, an iron-fisted regime built on deception and slaughter. Clones who had once followed orders without hesitation now fought back, not as soldiers of the Republic, but as warriors seeking redemption. There were whispers of entire clone-led insurgencies, cells operating in secret, sabotaging Imperial supply lines, disrupting stormtrooper recruitment efforts, even helping Jedi who had managed to evade the Purge. These former soldiers, once loyal to a Republic that no longer existed, had no place in the Empire's future. And so, they created their own path, carving out small victories in a galaxy that had forgotten them. But their numbers were dwindling. The Kaminoan cloning program had been shut down, and with each passing year, clones aged at an accelerated rate. The Empire had no use for them anymore. They were replaced with conscripted stormtroopers, men and women with no genetic programming, no camaraderie, only fear of their Imperial overseers. The legacy of the clones was fading, and they knew it. Yet for those who fought against their past, for those who chose resistance over obedience, the final years of their lives were not spent in service to an empire that had discarded them. They fought for something greater than orders. They fought for choice, for freedom, for the chance to undo, even in some small way, the tragedy that had begun with Order 66. And in that defiance, they reclaimed the legacy that had once been stolen from them. The Jedi had fallen, the Republic was gone, and the galaxy had been reshaped under the iron grip of the Empire. Yet, for all its power, the new order was built on fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of disobedience, fear of the truth. But even in the darkest times, resistance never truly died. It began in whispers, in secret meetings behind locked doors, in coded transmissions sent between those who still believed that the Empire could be fought. From the ashes of the Republic, the earliest sparks of rebellion took form. Mon Mothma, once a respected senator, saw the truth of what the Republic had become long before many of her colleagues. She had watched Palpatine consolidate power, had seen the Jedi fall, and had recognized that the so-called peace of the Empire was nothing more than submission. With careful precision, she cultivated allies, bringing together those who still held on to the ideals of democracy. She was not alone. Bail Organa, another survivor of the Senate's transformation, had been one of the few who tried to warn the Jedi before it was too late. Though he had failed to save the Order, he had not lost sight of its values. In the years following the Purge, Bail and Mon Mothma worked in secret, gathering resources, securing safe havens, and establishing networks that would one day form the foundation of the rebellion. But they needed more than politicians. They needed warriors. Many of the early recruits were soldiers who had fought in the Clone Wars, men and women who had once believed they were defending a republic worth saving. Now they saw their former comrades marching beneath Imperial banners, enforcing laws that stripped away freedoms they had once died to protect. Scattered across the galaxy, remnants of the Jedi Order played their own role in shaping the movement. Some, like Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, chose exile, understanding that their survival meant one day guiding the next generation. Others, like Kanan Jarrus, had no such luxury. They lived in hiding, keeping their connection to the Force a secret. But when the time came, they could not ignore the fight. The Empire underestimated the strength of those it had cast aside. It saw the Jedi as extinct, the Republic as forgotten, and any opposition as nothing more than scattered voices too weak to rise. But the more it tightened its grip, the more cracks began to form. A single act of defiance could spread across entire systems. A stolen shipment of weapons, a disrupted supply chain, a group of refugees safely smuggled past Imperial blockades. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Hope had not been extinguished. It had gone into hiding, waiting for the right moment to rise. The rebellion did not begin as a grand army, nor as a coordinated effort against the Empire's rule. It was a collection of individuals, bound together by the simple belief that the galaxy did not belong to tyrants. And slowly, through sacrifice and determination, that belief would grow into something the Empire could no longer ignore. The Jedi had once stood as symbols of justice and wisdom, their history stretching back thousands of years. They had shaped civilizations, guided leaders, and defended the Republic through wars and conflicts long before the Clone Wars. But under the Empire, they became nothing more than a ghost story, a fabricated myth that served only to justify their destruction. What the Jedi had built, the Empire sought to erase. Their teachings, their temples, their very existence. All of it buried beneath the weight of Imperial propaganda. On Coruscant, the Jedi Temple, once a beacon of knowledge and peace, was desecrated and repurposed. It was no longer a sanctuary for learning or a refuge for those seeking wisdom. It became the Imperial Palace, a fortress of oppression looming over the capital. The archives that had once preserved the accumulated knowledge of the Order were either destroyed or locked away, their secrets twisted to serve the Empire's interests. The Holocrons, containing the wisdom of Jedi past, were either confiscated or lost to time. Across the galaxy, temples on distant worlds suffered similar fates. Some were razed entirely, their ruins left as nothing more than scars on the planets they once protected. Others were converted into military installations, their sacred halls now echoing with the boots of stormtroopers instead of the footsteps of Jedi. Statues of fallen Jedi were toppled, their names scrubbed from records. Even the very word Jedi was treated as treasonous. To speak of them was to risk execution. But not everyone forgot. In hidden places, there were those who refused to let the memory of the Jedi die. On worlds where Jedi had once been protectors, secret shrines were built. Some carved their symbols into the walls of forgotten caves, etching their defiance into stone. Others whispered their stories in coded messages, passing on knowledge in ways the Empire could not easily silence. There were planets where the loss of the Jedi was felt deeply. The people of Felucia, who had fought alongside Aayla Secura, still spoke of her bravery in hushed tones. On Mygeeto, the memories of Ki-Adi-Mundi's last stand lingered among those who had seen the betrayal unfold. Kashyyyk's Wookiees, who had been defended by Yoda himself, honored the Jedi in secret ceremonies, knowing they would one day return. Among the ranks of the rebellion, there were those who sought not just to fight the Empire, but to restore what had been lost. Bail Organa worked tirelessly to protect whatever Jedi knowledge he could, smuggling artifacts and texts before they could be destroyed. Mon Mothma ensured that the Empire's lies about the Jedi were not the only story being told. Even among ordinary citizens, there were those who refused to let the past be rewritten. The Empire believed that by destroying the Jedi, they had erased them. But the memory of the Jedi was not so easily extinguished. It remained in the hearts of those who had fought beside them, in the whispers of those who still believed in their cause, and in the knowledge that even in the darkest times, the Force would always find a way. The Jedi had fallen, their temples desecrated, their name twisted into a lie. For decades, they existed only in hushed stories and fragmented records, scattered across the galaxy like embers buried beneath ash. But the Force is not bound by time, nor is it so easily extinguished. What was lost would be found again, and the legacy of the Jedi would rise once more. It began with a single figure, Luke Skywalker. Born in the shadow of the Empire, raised on a desert world with no knowledge of his true lineage, he seemed an unlikely savior. Yet, through him, the Jedi found new breath. Under the guidance of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, the last of the old masters, Luke stepped into a role he could barely understand. The Force called to him, and though he was untrained, it was enough. The Jedi's return had begun. His journey was not one of blind heroism, but of sacrifice and revelation. He faced the truths that had been hidden from him: his father's fall to darkness, the weight of his lineage, the knowledge that the Jedi had once failed. And yet, instead of breaking under that weight, he carried it forward. Unlike the Jedi of old, Luke was not bound by tradition. He learned from the past but was not shackled by it. His training was incomplete, yet his conviction was unshaken. In the final days of the Empire, Luke Skywalker did what generations of Jedi could not. He confronted the Sith, not through war or armies, but through understanding. Where others saw Darth Vader as a monster, Luke saw the man he had been, and in doing so he accomplished the impossible. He did not kill Vader, he saved him. With Anakin Skywalker's final act of redemption, the Sith's reign crumbled, and the Jedi's legacy was no longer one of failure, but of hope reborn. But the return of the Jedi was more than a single victory. The fall of the Empire left a galaxy in ruins, and from those ruins, Luke sought to rebuild. He searched for lost knowledge, gathering what fragments remained of the order that had come before. Holocrons hidden in forgotten corners of the galaxy, records smuggled away by those who had refused to let history be erased. Piece by piece, the Jedi's wisdom resurfaced. Yet the lessons of Order 66 could not be ignored. The Jedi had been powerful once, but that power had blinded them. Their adherence to rigid doctrine had made them vulnerable. Luke understood this. He did not seek to rebuild the Jedi as they had been, but as they could be. His vision was not of warriors leading armies, nor of rigid councils bound by ancient rules. Instead, he sought balance, a way for the Jedi to exist without falling into the same mistakes. The galaxy was not quick to accept their return. The scars of the past ran deep. Some still viewed the Jedi as traitors, others as relics of a forgotten age. The Empire had spent years rewriting history, convincing the people that the Jedi's destruction had been necessary. But the truth, like the Force itself, could not be silenced forever. Slowly, the name of the Jedi shifted from myth to reality once more. The Jedi had once been the guardians of peace. Now, they were something else, symbols of resilience, proof that even in the darkest times, the light endures. Luke's path was only the beginning. Others would come, drawn to the Force, guided by its will. The Order would rise again, not as an institution of control, but as a beacon of hope. The Sith had sought to erase the Jedi. They had come closer than ever before, and yet the Jedi remained. The destruction of the Jedi Order reshaped the galaxy, but its impact went beyond politics and war. It was not just the fall of warriors or the rise of an empire. It was a shift in the very balance of the Force. The Jedi Purge was more than an execution. It was an attempt to erase an ideology, to silence the guardians of balance. And yet, history has shown that the Force does not bow to conquerors. For those who lived through the fall, the weight of its consequences was inescapable. The Jedi had been more than defenders of peace. They were symbols of justice and morality. Their absence left entire worlds unprotected, forcing people to navigate a galaxy ruled by fear. Many had taken them for granted, only realizing their importance once they were gone. In their place, darkness thrived, oppression, unchecked power, and the slow erosion of hope. Yet in the void left behind, new paths emerged. Some worlds learned to govern themselves, while others fell into chaos. For some, the Jedi's destruction was a tragedy. For others, it was long overdue. The galaxy itself struggled with their legacy. Were they martyrs or relics of a failed philosophy? But the Force does not concern itself with politics. It does not record victories or defeats. It simply is. And in its endless cycle, it ensures that nothing, not even destruction, is permanent. Order 66 had been an atrocity, but it was not the end. The Force continued to call to those who would listen. Some, like Luke Skywalker, sought to rebuild. Others, never trained in the old ways, still felt its presence. The Jedi once believed balance came through their guidance, while the Sith sought to shape the Force to their will. Yet empires crumble, and the Force endures. Order 66 did not prove the end of the Jedi. It proved that their legacy could not be erased. They were not just warriors or scholars. They were symbols of hope and resistance, a testament to the eternal struggle to seek light in the face of darkness. And as long as the Force flows through the galaxy, their story will never truly end.